The translation matrix flickered twice before it steadied, and Captain Renata Vasic watched the alien admiral's face resolve on her tactical display with the kind of cold clarity that made lying impossible from either direction. The Jorathi admiral commanding Prefect Olvor, according to the intelligence brief that was already 14 hours stale, occupied the center of the screen like something carved from basalt and then taught to breathe. His face was broad, flat-planed, heavily ridged along the brow and jaw where the bioceramic plating that the Jorathi grew instead of bone created a permanent expression of architectural contempt. His eyes were recessed beneath that plating, dark amber, unblinking. Behind him, the command deck of his flagship stretched in a long curve of organic-looking consoles that pulsed with bioluminescent light greens and deep violets cycling in patterns that Vasic's intelligence officers said corresponded to the ship's autonomic functions. The Jorathi did not build their warships. They grew them. Captain Vasic, the translation matrix rendered in flat, accentless standard, 0.3 of a second behind the deep vibrations of Olvor's actual voice. You have positioned your fleet in violation of the Sethian Accord, Article 14. The demarcation corridor is 40,000 kilometers wide. Your forward elements are 9,000 kilometers inside it. Commanding Prefect Vasic said. Her voice was level. She had practiced this particular tone for 6 hours in her quarters before the channel opened calm enough to signal good faith, firm enough to signal that good faith had a shelf life. Your third expansion fleet crossed the demarcation corridor's outer boundary 19 hours ago. My forward elements adjusted their position in response. I am prepared to withdraw them to the corridor's edge the moment your fleet returns to its side. Olvor's amber eyes did not move. The bioceramic ridges along his jaw shifted slightly, a micro-expression that the intelligence brief flagged as either contemplation or irritation. The Jorathi had been studied for 12 years, and their facial expressions were still only 60% mapped. That 40% gap had killed people. We will discuss the matter of positions, Olvor said. But first, the broader question. Your government has proposed a renewal of the Sethian Accord for an additional 40-year term. The Jorathi prefecture has concerns. I'm aware of the concerns, Vasic said. That's why I'm here. She closed the channel display to a monitoring window and turned to face the Combat Information Center of the TDS Ardent Resolve. The CIC was a low-ceilinged compartment built for function over Comfort 12 consoles arranged in 3 tiers. Each one staffed by someone who had not slept more than 4 hours in the past 36. The overhead lights were dimmed to combat illumination, casting everything in a cold blue wash that made healthy faces look sick and tired faces look dead. Commander Pavel Orant, her executive officer, was standing at the tactical plot with his arms crossed, and an expression that said he had opinions about the conversation he had just overheard, but was disciplined enough to wait until she asked for them. She did not ask, not yet. Status of the fleet, she said. Orant pulled up the display. 23 blue icons arranged in a layered crescent formation along the human side of the demarcation corridor, the Sethian line, as the diplomatic corps called it, or the dead man's fence, as every sailor in the Terran Frontier Command called it. The Sethian Accord had established this corridor 40 years ago, at the end of the First Jorathi War, as a buffer zone between human-controlled space and the Jorathi prefecture's expanding border. 40,000 kilometers of nothing. No stations, no outposts, no sensor buoys. Just empty space that both sides had agreed to leave empty, and that agreement had held for 4 decades because both sides understood that the alternative was a second war that neither could afford. Now the accord was expiring. The Jorathi had been growing new ships, hundreds of them, according to signals intelligence in the deep-core biological foundries that the prefecture maintained in systems that human sensors could not reach. And 14 days ago, the The Jorathi Third Expansion Fleet had moved to the edge of the demarcation corridor with 167 capital-class bioships and an estimated 400 escort organisms, and stopped there, and waited. Vasek had been sent with 23 warships, a diplomatic mandate, and orders that contradicted each other in ways that only a committee could produce. Negotiate the renewal of the Sethian Accord. Defend the corridor if negotiations fail. Do not fire first. Do not lose the corridor. Do not provoke an incident. Do not appear weak. She had read the orders 3 times and then locked them in her desk drawer, because following all of them simultaneously was physically impossible, and she had learned years ago that impossible orders were a government's way of saying, "Use your judgment, but we will blame you if it goes wrong." All 23 ships at station, Orant reported. Weapons systems are hot across the fleet. Point defense grids are active. The Cairn Hello and the Ashburn are running their reactor cores at 70% per your standing order, ready to go to full power in 90 seconds. Fighter wings are loaded and locked on the Ironhold's flight deck, but not launched. We are, as ordered, a perfectly peaceful fleet that happens to be ready to kill everything in front of it. "Thank you, Pavel," Vasek said. "The poetry was unnecessary." "The poetry is all I have left, Captain. I gave up sleep 2 days ago." Vasek moved to her command chair, but did not sit. She rested one hand on the armrest and studied the tactical plot. The Jorathi fleet was visible on the far side of the corridor, 167 red icons arranged in a formation that the intelligence analysts called the Thorn Wall. It was a defensive posture in theory. In practice, it could transition to an offensive spearhead in approximately 6 minutes, because the Jorathi did not draw meaningful distinctions between defense and offense. Their bioships were grown for multi-role function. Every hull was a weapon, a sensor platform, and a carrier simultaneously. 23 against 167. The math was simple. The implications were not. "Open a secure channel to the Ironhold," Vasek said. "Get me Captain Lehane." The connection took 11 seconds, encrypted. Frequency hopped. Routed through a relay that was itself disguised as a piece of debris from a mining accident that had never actually happened. When Lehane's face appeared, she was in her flight operations center, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a carrier preparing for a launch that everyone hoped would not happen. "Captain Lehane, status of your flight wings." 4 full squadrons loaded and locked, Captain. 64 fighters. Pilots are suited and in their cockpits on rotating 2-hour readiness cycles. We can have the first squadron in space in 4 minutes from your order, full wing deployed in 11. Lehane paused. "My pilots are good, Captain, but 64 fighters against whatever the Jorathi are carrying in those bioship bays. We don't have solid numbers, but intelligence estimates between 800 and 1,200 drone organisms." "That's a ratio I don't love." "Nobody loves the ratio, Captain. That's why we're negotiating." "Yes, ma'am, and if the negotiating stops." Vasek looked at Lehane's face on the screen, steady, professional, asking the question every captain in the fleet was asking in their own way. "What is the plan when the talking fails?" "If the negotiating stops," Vasek said, "I will give you enough warning to get your people in space. That is a promise I intend to keep." She closed the channel and turned back to the CIC. The next diplomatic session was in 4 hours. 4 hours to prepare talking points that might prevent a war, and 4 hours to prepare contingencies for what happened when they didn't. "Pavel," she said, "get me the intelligence summary on Ulvor, everything we have, personal history, command decisions, known temperament. I want to know what he cares about." Orant nodded and moved to the intelligence station. Vasek sat in her command chair and pulled up the original diplomatic brief on her personal display. The brief was written in the careful, bloodless language that diplomats used when they wanted to sound optimistic without committing to optimism. The Jorathi prefecture, the brief explained, had legitimate security concerns regarding the Sethian corridor. The expansion of human colonial activity in adjacent sectors had created new friction points. The Jorathi biological infrastructure required certain mineral-rich asteroid fields that fell within the corridor's buffer zone. A revised accord that addressed these concerns while maintaining the corridor's fundamental integrity was achievable. Vasek had been in the military for 22 years, and she had learned that achievable was what people said about things that were possible in theory and catastrophic in practice. The brief did not mention the 167 bioships on the other side of the corridor. It did not mention the biological foundries running at full capacity in systems beyond human sensor range. It did not mention the 3 previous attempts to negotiate with the Jorathi prefecture over the past 18 months, all of which had ended with the Jorathi delegation walking out when the word limitation was introduced. The brief mentioned none of this because the brief was written by people who would not be here when the talking stopped and the shooting started. Vasek set it aside and waited for something useful. The intelligence summary on Ulvor arrived 40 minutes later. Vasek read it in her quarters, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before she remembered to drink it. Commanding Prefect Ulvor, age approximately 140 standard years, young for a Jorathi senior commander, rose through the prefecture's naval hierarchy during the post-war reconstruction period, meaning he had never fought in the First Jorathi War but had spent his entire career studying it. Known for methodical planning, extensive use of biological reconnaissance organisms, and a command philosophy that prioritized territorial expansion through what the Jorathi called natural growth, a concept that translated roughly to "we will take what our biology requires, and our biology always requires more." He had 3 known command principles, according to a captured Jorathi signals officer who had been debriefed 2 years ago. First, the fleet is a living organism, and living organisms do not retreat from sustenance. Second, negotiation is a form of reconnaissance. You learn the enemy's limits by testing them with words before testing them with weapons. Third, the species that stops expanding has already begun dying. Vasek closed the file and sat in the silence of her quarters for a long time. Ulvor was not going to negotiate in good faith. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own ship's engines, not from analysis, but from the deep pattern recognition that 22 years of service had built into her bones. He was here to take the corridor. The diplomatic sessions were his reconnaissance. Every question he asked, every concession he probed, every moment of apparent reasonableness was a sensor sweep, mapping her limits the way his biological scouts mapped asteroid fields. And when he had found the limit, when he knew exactly how far she could bend before she broke, he would act. She knew this. She had known it before she left port. The intelligence analysts knew it. The diplomatic corps, in their bloodless way, probably knew it, and yet the orders said negotiate. The orders said do not fire first. The orders said renew the accord if possible. And so she would negotiate. She would sit across from Ulvor and trade proposals and counter-proposals and carefully worded compromises, and she would do it well, because the alternative was to give up before trying, and Renata Vasek did not give up before trying. Even when trying was a formality, even when the outcome was written in the trajectory of 167 bioships that had been grown specifically for this moment. The second diplomatic session began at 800 ship time. Vasek had slept for 2 hours and spent the remaining time in the CIC reviewing contingency plans with her senior staff. If the Jorathi initiate, she had told them, gathered around the plotting table at 500 with coffee and exhaustion, and the grim clarity that comes from accepting bad odds, their most likely approach is a dispersal surge. 167 bioships do not attack in formation the way our ships do. They fragment into autonomous hunting groups of 5 to 7, each group targeting a single human vessel. Their advantage is numbers and biological coordination. Each hunting group shares sensor data through a neural link network that lets them function as a single organism with multiple bodies. Our advantage is concentrated firepower and superior range. Their bioarmor is tough, but it answers to railgun slugs at velocity. The question is whether we can kill enough of them fast enough to break the neural link's coordination threshold. What's the threshold? Commander Lehane had asked via HoloLink. Intelligence estimates that if we destroy approximately 30% of the bioships in the first engagement, the neural link network degrades significantly. The remaining ships lose coordination, revert to individual combat behavior, and become vulnerable to concentrated fire. 30% of 167 is 50 ships. Vasek let that number sit in the room. We need to kill 50 capital-class bioships before they can close to boarding range. With 23 ships, that means each of us needs to account for roughly 2 kills in the opening salvo. 2 kills per ship in the first salvo, Captain Darren Lowe of the TDS Cairnhallow had said. That's achievable if we fire at optimal range and if the Jorathi come straight at us. If they disperse early, the math gets worse. That's why we have contingency positions, Vasek had said. She pulled up the tactical overlay. The corridor is 40,000 kilometers wide. I've designated 3 fallback lines: Lion at 30,000 clicks from our current position, Tiger at 20, and Bear at 10. Each line has pre-plotted firing solutions for overlapping fields of fire. If the initial engagement does not achieve the 30% threshold, we fall back to Lion and concentrate. If Lion fails, Tiger. If Tiger fails, Bear. And if Bear fails, someone had asked. Vasek did not remember who. If Bear fails, we have done our duty and the corridor belongs to the Jorathi until someone with more ships comes to take it back. No one had spoken for a moment after that. Then Orant had cleared his throat and said, on a more cheerful note, the mess is serving eggs this morning. And the meeting had ended with the particular dark humor that holds a crew together when the numbers are against them. Now Vasek was back on the diplomatic channel, and Olvor's face filled her screen again, and they were discussing Article 7 of the proposed revised Accord, the mineral rights provisions for the asteroid fields within the corridor. The prefecture requires full extraction rights in the Caliph Belt, Olvor said. The asteroids contain bioactive silicates essential to our foundry processes. This is not a negotiable point. The Caliph Belt sits at the geometric center of the corridor, Vasek replied. Granting full extraction rights there would require Jorathi industrial vessels to operate continuously inside the buffer zone. That fundamentally compromises the corridor's purpose. The corridor's purpose is to prevent conflict. Denying the prefecture essential resources creates the conflict you claim to prevent. I understand the concern, Commanding Prefect. I am prepared to propose a joint access framework scheduled extraction windows, with monitoring from both sides, ensuring that neither party maintains a permanent presence. Olvor's jaw ridges shifted, that micro-expression again. Vasek's intelligence officer had flagged it in real time on a secondary screen, possible contempt/possible calculation, the 40% gap. Joint access, Olvor repeated as if testing the weight of the words. Monitored by whom? A bilateral commission, equal representation. And if the commission disagrees? Standard arbitration protocols, the same framework used in the original accord. The original accord, Olvor said, was written by the victors of the First War. Its arbitration protocols were designed to favor human interests. The prefecture will not submit to them again. Vasek felt the negotiation shift beneath her like a ship's deck in rough water. This was the heart of it, not the asteroid fields, not the mineral rights, not the technical provisions of Articles 1 through 12. The Jorathi had lost the First War. They had accepted the Sethian Accord because they had no choice, and they had spent 40 years growing strong enough to ensure they would never have no choice again. I am authorized to discuss revised arbitration frameworks, Vasek said carefully. If you have a specific proposal, I will review it and transmit it to my government. Your government, Olvor said, which sent a military officer to conduct diplomatic negotiations. This is itself a statement, Captain. A fleet positioned on a border with weapons charged, commanded by a warrior, not a diplomat. Your government's proposal is the fleet behind you. Vasek met his eyes through the screen. The amber irises did not waver. The bioceramic ridges were still. My government sent me because I understand what is at stake on both sides of this corridor, Vasek said. I have no interest in fighting a war that does not need to happen. Then we agree, Olvor said. No war needs to happen, the corridor needs only to be adjusted. The word adjusted landed in the CIC like a shell that had not yet detonated. Vasek saw Oren's jaw tighten at the tactical plot. She saw the intelligence officer's hands pause over his console. Adjusted how? Vasek asked. The prefecture proposes a new demarcation. The corridor's human side boundary moves 15,000 kilometers toward your current positions. This provides the prefecture with access to the Caliph Belt and the Valseth mining region without requiring joint frameworks or bilateral commissions. Clean, simple, permanent. 15,000 kilometers, more than a third of the corridor's width, absorbed into Joratha-controlled space. Every sensor station, every early warning relay, every defensive advantage the corridor provided to the human frontier gone. And with them, the strategic depth that made the Sethane line defensible in the first place. That proposal is not a revision of the accord, Vasek said. It is a replacement. All growth requires replacement of what came before, Captain. The seedling replaces the seed. The forest replaces the seedling. The prefecture is a forest. It does not shrink. Vasek held his gaze for 3 seconds. The number sat in her mind like a piece of wreckage, 15,000. She ran it against the defensive models she had memorized before leaving port. At 15,000 kilometers concession, the Terran early warning network along the frontier would lose 47% of its sensor coverage. Response time for a reinforcement fleet coming from Keithrain Station would increase from 9 hours to 14. The defensive depth that had allowed Frontier Command to contest any future incursion would shrink from a viable buffer to a symbolic gesture. Olvor was not asking for an adjustment. He was asking for the strategic architecture that had kept the peace for 40 years. Then she said, I will transmit your proposal to my government for review. I expect to have a response within 12 hours. Olvor inclined his head, a gesture that might have been courtesy or might have been the patient tilt of something that already knew the answer. The channel closed. The CIC was silent for 4 seconds. Then Oren spoke. He's not negotiating. No, Vasek said, he's measuring. Measuring what? How long we'll sit here before we understand that? He's been measuring since the first session. Every proposal, every counterproposal, he is mapping our response patterns the way his bioships map a system before they consume it. When he has enough data, he will act. How long do we have? Vasek looked at the tactical plot. 167 red icons, 23 blue. The corridor between them, 40,000 kilometers of nothing that had kept the peace for 40 years. I don't know, she said, but I intend to keep negotiating until the last possible moment. Why? Oren's voice was quiet, not challenging, genuinely asking. Vasek looked at him. Because the moment I stop negotiating is the moment I admit that 19,000 people under my command are going to fight a battle that was decided before we arrived. And I am not ready to admit that yet. She transmitted Olvor's proposal to Frontier Command with her own assessment appended, a 4-page analysis that recommended rejection, but acknowledged that rejection would likely trigger a Jorathi military response. She estimated a 70% probability that the third expansion fleet would advance within 48 hours of receiving a negative answer. She requested reinforcements. She did not expect to receive them. While the diplomatic traffic crawled through encrypted relay channels at the speed of light and bureaucracy, Vasek worked the military problem. She pulled up the fleet roster on her personal terminal and ran the readiness numbers one more time. Of her 23 warships, 18 were rated combat-ready. 3 had deferred maintenance issues that their captains had flagged before departure: worn magnetic accelerator coils on the TDS Ashburn, a suspect coolant loop on the frigate TDS Sentinel Dawn, and intermittent fire control calibration, drift on the TDS Pale Vigil that her engineers had been chasing for 2 weeks without finding the root cause. The remaining 2 ships, the Ironhold and the Blackmount, were the fleet's heaviest hitters, both recently refitted and operating at peak. 23 ships, 18 clean, 3 with asterisks, 2 excellent, against 167 bioships that did not have maintenance issues because they healed. She convened a tactical planning session with her 3 senior captains, Lehane of the Ironhold, Lowe of the Cairnhallow, and Commander Sierra Voss of the TDS Blackmount, a heavy cruiser whose railgun batteries were the most powerful in the fleet. They met in a secure hollow conference, their faces floating in blue light above the plotting table. "We have a math problem," Vasek said. 23 against 167. I need solutions that change the math. Lowe spoke first. "Mines. The corridor is 40,000 kilometers wide. We concede the Jorathi approach vectors with autonomous mine drones, not enough to stop them, but enough to thin the first wave and disrupt their dispersal surge." "How many mines?" "With our current loadout, approximately 300. Each mine drone carries a single high-yield warhead. Against Jorathi bioarmor, we're looking at maybe a 40% kill rate per detonation. That gives us 120 kills if every mine finds a target." "They won't," Voss said. "The Jorathi use biological reconnaissance organisms, living sensor drones that sweep ahead of the fleet. They'll detect and neutralize at least half the mines before the main body arrives. Call it 60 kills. 60 bioships out of 167. That's better than 30%. That changes the equation." "It also takes time to deploy," Vasek said. "Deploying 300 mine drones into the corridor takes approximately 14 hours. Ulvor will see it. And the moment he sees mines going into the corridor, he will know that we have abandoned diplomacy." The room was quiet. "Which means," Vasek continued, "that I cannot authorize mine deployment until I am certain that diplomacy has failed. And I will not be certain until it actually fails. Which means the mines go out at the last moment, under the worst conditions, with the least time to position them properly." "The tragedy of doing the right thing," Orant murmured from the corner, "is that it usually costs you the tactical advantage." Vasek ignored him because he was right, and because acknowledging it would not help. "Lehane, your fighters. I want a pre-plotted strike package ready for the Jorathi command bioship, the flagship, the one carrying Ulvor. If we can kill the command bioship in the first minutes of an engagement, the Neuralink network loses its central node. The hunting groups lose coordination faster." "I can put together a 16-fighter strike package," Lehane said. "But the command bioship will be at the center of their formation, behind layers of escort organisms. My fighters will have to punch through at least 3 defensive screens to reach it. Casualties will be high." "How high?" Lehane's face was steady. "I estimate 60 to 70% losses in the strike package. 10 or 11 fighters out of 16. Vasek absorbed that number the way she absorbed all the numbers, with the careful, clinical precision of someone who understood that each digit was a cockpit, a name, a family that would receive a notification. "Prepare the package. Volunteers only." "They'll all volunteer, Captain." "I know, choose the best 16. The third diplomatic session happened at 1400. Vasek had received a preliminary response from Frontier Command. The 15,000-kilometer concession was unacceptable. A counterproposal of 5,000 kilometers was authorized, with expanded mineral rights provisions and a new arbitration framework based on neutral party mediation. Reinforcements were being considered but could not be committed at this time. Being considered. Vasek filed that phrase in the same mental cabinet where she kept achievable and strategic patience, and all the other terms that meant no one is coming, you are on your own. She opened the channel. Ulvor appeared. Behind him, the bioluminescent patterns on his command deck had shifted from green-violet to a deeper amber. Vasek's intelligence officer noted the change on his secondary screen, fleet biorhythm shift, possible heightened alert state. Commanding Prefect, my government has reviewed your proposal. The 15,000-kilometer adjustment is not acceptable. However, we are prepared to discuss a more modest revision, 5,000 kilometers, combined with expanded mineral extraction rights in the Caliph Belt under a revised arbitration framework. Ulvor listened. His expression did not change. When Vasek finished, he was silent for 6 seconds. 5,000 kilometers, he said. Captain Vasek, I will be direct with you, because I believe you are a person who values directness. The prefecture did not grow 167 capital bioships and move them to this corridor to negotiate for 5,000 kilometers. The resources required to produce this fleet, the biological investment, the genetic engineering, the foundry time represent a commitment that my government does not make for marginal gains. I understand the scale of your commitment, Vasek said. I am asking you to consider that the scale of the response it will provoke is equally significant. Your 23 ships. My 23 ships, and the ships that will come after them. Ulvor tilted his head. Perhaps, in time, but time is biological, Captain. By the time your reinforcements arrive, the corridor will be a Jorathi space, and the cost of retaking it will be greater than the cost of accepting the new reality. This is the arithmetic of growth. The forest does not negotiate with the field it replaces. It simply grows. Forests burn, Commanding Prefect. The words were out before Vasek could calibrate them. In her peripheral vision, she saw Solin's hand freeze over her console. Orent took half a step forward and then stopped himself. The CIC held its breath. On screen, Ulvor's jaw ridges shifted sharply this time, the micro-expression unmistakable even across the 40% gap. She had surprised him, perhaps offended him, perhaps both. An interesting metaphor, Ulvor said. His voice had dropped half a register, the vibrations carrying a subsonic weight that the translation matrix struggled to render. Fire is temporary. Growth is permanent. The ashes themselves become soil for the next forest. I did not come here to trade metaphors, Vasek said. I came to find an agreement that keeps both our governments from a war that will cost more than either side can afford. If you are prepared to discuss terms within the framework I have presented, I am here. If you are not, then tell me plainly, and we will both know where we stand. Ulvor studied her through the screen. 10 seconds. 15. The bioluminescent patterns on his command deck cycled through amber to a deep, pulsing red that Vasek had never seen in any intelligence briefing. I will consult with my government, Ulvor said. We will speak again in 8 hours. The channel closed. Vasek sat in her command chair and felt the weight of what had just happened settle over the CIC like pressure building before a storm. The bioluminescence, she said. What was the red? The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Kira Solin, young, sharp, and quietly terrified in a way that she hid behind meticulous data analysis, checked her screens. Unknown, Captain. We have no recorded instance of red spectrum bioluminescence on a Jorathi command deck. It could be a stress response. It could be a fleet-wide signal. It could be aesthetic. We don't know. Best guess, Fleet readiness escalation. The bioships are linked through neural networks. A color shift on the command deck could propagate through the entire fleet. If I had to guess, and I want to be clear that this is a guess, Olvor just put his fleet on heightened alert. Vasek nodded. She turned to the tactical plot and studied the Jorathi formation again. The thorn wall had not moved, but she noticed something new. The spacing between individual bioships had increased by approximately 200 meters across the entire formation. Not much. Not enough to trigger a tactical alert, but enough, if you knew what you were looking at, to recognize the first loosening of a formation preparing to fragment into hunting groups. Orant, check the Jorathi formation spacing against our baseline from 48 hours ago. Orant ran the comparison. His expression changed. Formation density has decreased by 11%. Individual ship separation is widening, consistent with pre-deployment staging. He is not consulting his government, Vasek said quietly. He is prepositioning. The consultation is theater. She had expected this. She had expected it from the first session. From the first moment Olvor's face appeared on her screen, and she had recognized in his amber eyes the particular calm of someone who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. Pavel, she said quietly, begin mine deployment, 300 drones, standard dispersal pattern across the corridor's Jorathi approach vectors. Orant looked at her. Captain, you said you would not authorize deployment until diplomacy had failed. Diplomacy has not failed, Vasek said. I have another session in 8 hours, but the deployment takes 14 hours, and I no longer believe I have 14 hours of diplomacy left. So the mines go out now, and I will continue negotiating while they deploy, and if by some miracle the talking works, I will recall them. And if Olvor detects the deployment, then he will know what I already know, that this was always going to end one way, and perhaps knowing that will give him a reason to surprise me. The mine drones launched from their deployment tubes in a staggered sequence, each one a dark cylinder roughly 3 meters long, cold running, minimal signature, programmed to drift into position along the pre-plotted approach vectors and wait. 300 tiny instruments of last resort, seeding the emptiness between two fleets that faced each other across a line that had held for 40 years and was about to break. While the mines deployed, Vasek worked. She finalized the contingency battle plan, the Lion-Tiger-Bear fallback lines, the firing solutions, the fighter strike package, the emergency withdrawal routes. She reviewed the damage control protocols for every ship in the fleet. She spoke individually with each of her 23 captains, spending between 3 and 8 minutes with each one, asking about their readiness, their crews, their concerns. She did not lie to any of them. She told them what she knew, that the negotiation was unlikely to succeed, that a Jorathi advance was probable within 48 hours, that the fleet was outnumbered 7-1. Every captain said the same thing in their own way: we are ready. Captain Lowe of the Cairnhallow, whose voice never changed register regardless of the circumstances, said, "My ship will be where you need it, Captain. Tell me when." Captain Voss of the Blackmount, whose railgun batteries could punch through Jorathi bioarmor at 30,000 kilometers, said, "I've run the firing solutions 9 times. We can kill 3 bioships in the opening salvo if we fire at optimal range. I intend to make it 4. Captain Lehane of the Ironhold, whose flight deck was loaded with 64 fighters, and 16 of them were already designated for the command ship strike, said, "My volunteers are ready. They understand the odds. They asked me to tell you that the odds are not your fault." The words hit Vasek harder than she showed. She thanked Lehane and closed the channel and sat alone in her quarters for 3 minutes, staring at the bulkhead, before she stood up and went back to the CIC, because there was still work to do, and the time for sitting alone with the weight of it was a luxury she could not afford. At 2200, 6 hours before the next diplomatic session, the first anomaly appeared. Captain, Lieutenant Solin's voice was sharp. Jorathi fleet movement. Forward elements, approximately 20 escort organisms, have advanced 3,000 kilometers into the corridor. Vasek was at the tactical plot in 4 strides. The display showed 20 red icons pushing forward from the Thorn Wall formation, moving slowly, deliberately, into the buffer zone. "Reconnaissance screen," Oren asked. "Maybe," Solin said, "or a probe testing our response." Vasek watched the red icons creep forward, 3,000 kilometers into a 40,000-kilometer corridor. Not a violation in itself. The corridor was supposed to be empty from both sides, and her own forward elements were inside it too. But the movement was deliberate, timed, and coordinated in a way that felt less like reconnaissance and more like the first note of a piece of music that had already been composed. "Hold position," Vasek ordered. "All ships maintain current stations. Do not react." "Captain." "If we react, we validate the probe. If we hold, he learns nothing from it, and I still have a session in 6 hours. I will not throw that away because 20 escort organisms moved 3,000 kilometers." She watched the red icons for another 12 minutes. They did not advance further. They simply held, embedded in the corridor like splinters in skin, not dangerous in themselves, but proof that something had been breached. "Solin, are they scanning?" "Continuously, Captain. Biological sensor organisms, they shed microdrones from their ventral surfaces. Each microdrone drifts for approximately 90 seconds, sampling the electromagnetic environment, then returns and is reabsorbed. They are mapping our emissions profile in real time." "Can we mask?" "Not without going to full emissions blackout, which would mean shutting down active sensors and half our fire control systems. We would be blind and deaf." "Then let them scan," Vasek said. "If they want to know what we are carrying, they will learn soon enough." The hours passed. The escort organisms held their advanced position. The mine drones continued their silent deployment, 173 now in position, another 127 still drifting toward their coordinates. The fleet waited. Vasek reviewed her notes for the next session, refining the 5,000-kilometer counterproposal with additional provisions that she did not believe would matter, but that gave her something to put on the table, something to extend the conversation, something to keep the words flowing for another hour, another day. She slept for 90 minutes. She dreamed about a bridge, an old stone bridge over a river she had never seen, built with enormous care by people who knew it would be destroyed. She woke with the image still vivid, and a feeling in her chest like a hand pressing down, and she showered and dressed and went to the CIC and did not mention the dream to anyone. At 400, 2 hours before the session, the second anomaly. "Captain, Jorathi fleet reconfiguration. The Thorn Wall formation is changing." Vasek looked at the tactical plot. The 167 red icons were shifting, not advancing, not retreating, but reorganizing. The defensive Thorn Wall was dissolving, its elements redistributing into something else. Something the tactical computer was trying to classify and failing, because Jorathi formations were biological, fluid, and did not map neatly onto human tactical databases. "Analysis," Vasek said. Solin worked her console with fast, precise keystrokes. "The formation is transitioning to what appears to be best match in our database is a dispersal surge staging pattern. The individual bioships are spacing out to optimal separation for independent hunting group deployment. This is consistent with a pre-assault configuration. Time to full transition. At current rate, approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. The session was in 2 hours. Vasek did the math and felt the last thin membrane of hope stretch to the breaking point. Mine deployment status. 241 drones in position, 59 still deploying, full coverage in approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. The Jorathi would be in assault configuration in 4. The mines would not be fully deployed before Ulvor was ready to move. Vasek stood at the plotting table and made the calculation that she had been delaying since the first session, the calculation that lived underneath all the proposals and counter-proposals and carefully worded compromises. She had 23 ships. Ulvor had 167. Even with the mines, even with the fighter strike, even with the railgun batteries and the fallback lines and every tactical advantage she could manufacture, the numbers said the same thing they had said from the beginning. This fleet could hurt the Jorathi badly enough to make the Second Jorathi War expensive, but it could not win. Not here, not with these numbers. But expensive mattered. If she could destroy 30% of the Third Expansion Fleet 50 bioships in the first engagement, the Jorathi advance would stall. The Neuralink degradation would buy time. Reinforcements could arrive. The corridor might hold, not through her victory but through Ulvor's realization that the cost of taking it was higher than he had calculated. That was the mission, not victory. Cost imposition, making the forest pay for every meter of field it consumed until the price exceeded the value. She checked her chrono, 4:30, 90 minutes until the next session. She used every one of them. She reviewed the Ironhold's fighter ordnance loadout one more time. Each of the 64 fighters carried 2 Mark IX anti-capital torpedoes and a rotary point defense cannon. The 16 designated for the command ship strike carried 4 torpedoes each, giving the package 36 additional warheads at the cost of maneuverability. It was a trade-off that favored the mission and punished the pilots. Vasek had approved it because the math demanded it, and because she understood that the person who approved it should also be the person who lost sleep over it. She walked the CIC one more time, stopping at each station. The sensor operator was running continuous passive sweeps, building a real-time picture of the Jorathi fleet's disposition. The communications officer was monitoring 11 different frequencies for any sign of Jorathi fleet chatter that might indicate an imminent launch. The damage control coordinator had pre-staged repair teams at every critical junction in the ship. Everyone was doing their job. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was steady. She opened the diplomatic channel at 600 exactly. Ulvor appeared. The bioluminescence behind him was red, deep, steady, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Commanding Prefect," Vasek said, "I have a revised proposal. Extended mineral rights access across the Caliph Belt and the Valseth region, with a 5-year phased implementation, monitored by a neutral third party agreed upon by both governments. The corridor boundary adjusts 3,000 kilometers, not 15, not 5. 3. A meaningful gesture that addresses your security concerns while preserving the corridor's strategic function." She had worked on this proposal for 4 hours. She had refined every clause, anticipated every objection, built in concessions that went further than her orders authorized, because she had decided that exceeding her authority was preferable to watching 19,000 people die for a line that a committee had drawn 40 years ago. She believed in the proposal. She believed it was fair. She believed it gave Ulvor enough to justify standing down without losing face. She did not believe he would accept it. Ulvor listened. He listened with the patience of stone. When she finished, he was silent for 11 seconds. "Captain Vasek," he said, "I have valued these conversations. You are a skilled negotiator and a worthy adversary. In another context, I believe we could have reached an agreement that satisfied both our governments." He paused. "But you and I both know that agreements are built on balance, and the balance between our forces is not equal. You have 23 ships. I have 167. This is not a negotiation between equals. This is a courtesy I have extended while my fleet completed its preparations." The words landed in the CIC with the finality of bulkhead doors closing. "I will give you 1 hour, Ulvor said. 1 hour to withdraw your fleet beyond the corridor's far boundary. After that, the Third Expansion Fleet will advance and the corridor will become prefectural space. This is not a threat. It is a biological reality. Growth does not negotiate, Captain. It proceeds. The channel closed. The CIC was silent for 3 seconds. Then every station activated simultaneously, and the ship transformed from a vessel at diplomatic readiness to a warship preparing for battle. And the transition was so practiced and so fast that Vasek understood her crew had been expecting this moment for days. General quarters, Vasek said. Her voice was calm. All ships' battle stations, execute contingency alpha, mine drones to active targeting mode. Fighter launch sequence. Ironhold, begin deployment of all 4 squadrons. Railgun batteries, weapons free on my command. Fallback lines Lion, Tiger, and Bear are now active. Captain, Oren said. He was already at the tactical plot coordinating the fleet's transition. He gave us 1 hour. He gave us 1 hour because it takes his fleet approximately 1 hour to complete the transition from staging to assault configuration. The clock is his, not ours. The fleet moved with the disciplined urgency of people who had been rehearsing for this, under the polite fiction of readiness drills. The Ironhold's flight deck erupted with fighters, 64 craft launching in rapid sequence, their drive plumes cutting bright lines across the dark. The Cairnhallow and the Ashburn brought their reactors to full power, the energy spike registering across every sensor in the corridor. The Blackmont's railgun batteries rotated into firing position, their magnetic accelerator rails humming with the particular vibration that meant kinetic death, was ready to travel at a significant fraction of light speed. The mine drones, 241 in position, the remaining 59 now racing to their coordinates at maximum thrust, went active. Their targeting systems powered up, their warheads armed, and 241 tiny points of silent lethality waited in the dark between the 2 fleets like seeds planted in a field that was about to become a battlefield. Vasek stood at the tactical plot and watched the Jorathi fleet complete its transition. The Thorn Wall was gone. In its place, 167 bioships had distributed into hunting groups clusters of 5 to 7, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Each cluster pulsed with synchronized bioluminescence, their Neuralink networks binding them into multi-bodied organisms that thought and moved and killed as one. The command bioship, Ulvor's flagship, the largest vessel in the formation, its hull a dark mass of bioceramic plating and organic weapon arrays, sat at the center of the formation, surrounded by 12 escort organisms that functioned as both bodyguards and signal amplifiers for the Neuralink network. Strike package, Vasek said. Status. 16 fighters formed and holding at Rally Point Kestrel, Lehane reported. Strike lead is Lieutenant Commander Mari. She says she's ready. Hold at Kestrel until my order. Understood. Vasek looked at the clock. 41 minutes left of Ulvor's hour. 41 minutes until 167 bioships surged forward, and the Second Jorathi War began. Here, in a corridor of empty space that 2 civilizations had agreed to keep empty, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. She had one more thing to do. Open a channel to Ulvor, diplomatic frequency. Orent looked at her. Captain. One more time, Pavel. The channel opened. Ulvor appeared. The red bioluminescence behind him was brighter now, pulsing faster, and for the first time Vasek could see other Jorathi officers moving on his command deck, their movements quick and purposeful. Commanding Prefect, Vasek said, I am not withdrawing. I expected as much. I want you to understand something. In approximately 40 minutes, your fleet will advance. My fleet will engage. We are outnumbered 7 to 1. I expect significant casualties on both sides. I expect that your fleet will eventually take this corridor because the mathematics favor you, but I want you to know the cost. She pulled up a data file and transmitted it on the diplomatic channel, an open, unencrypted transmission that Ulvor's intelligence officers could verify independently. It contained the precise specifications of the mine drone field, 241 active warheads positioned across his approach vectors. It contained the Blackmont's railgun battery specifications and effective range. It contained the fighter strike package's existence, though not its target. 241 mines in your path, Vasek said. Railgun batteries that will fire at 30,000 kilometers, 64 fighters with anti-capital ordnance, 23 warships that will not retreat. You will take this corridor, commanding prefect, but you will pay for it with 50 of your bioships at minimum, perhaps 70. And your Neuralink network will degrade, and your surviving ships will fight as individuals instead of as a coordinated organism. And by the time you reach the far side of this corridor, you will command a fleet that has been wounded badly enough that holding what you have taken will require resources your prefecture may not have. She paused. I am telling you this because I want you to have the information, not because I expect it to change your decision. You have already decided. But I want the record to show that you knew the cost before you paid it. And I want you to know that I genuinely tried to find another way. Ulva regarded her through the screen. The amber eyes were steady. The bioceramic ridges were still. And for the first time in 4 days of negotiation, Vasek saw something in his expression that the 40% gap could not obscure a flicker of something that might have been respect, or might have been the Jorathi equivalent of sorrow for a worthy adversary about to be consumed. You are a remarkable officer, Captain Vasek, Ulvor said. In the prefecture, officers who build beautiful strategies against impossible odds are called Kethvari, those who carve monuments in sand, knowing the tide will come. It is not an insult. It is the highest praise we give to warriors who understand futility and choose to act anyway. I don't need your praise, commanding prefect. I need you to withdraw. The forest does not withdraw, Captain, but I will remember your name. When the histories of this corridor are written in our biological archives, Renata Vasek will be recorded as the human who understood what was coming and stood anyway. The channel closed for the last time. Vasek turned to face her CIC. Every station was manned. Every screen was live. Every face was watching her, waiting for the order that would begin what everyone in the room had known was coming since the day they arrived. She looked at the clock, 22 minutes. Fleet-wide, she said. Oren opened the channel, 23 ships. 19,000 personnel, all listening. This is Captain Vasek. In approximately 20 minutes, the Jorathi 3rd Expansion Fleet will advance across the Sethin corridor. We will engage. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending the odds favor us. They do not. But the odds are not the mission. The mission is cost. Every bioship we destroy, every hunting group we break, every minute we hold this line buys time for reinforcements, time for the frontier to prepare, time for the prefecture to realize that the field they are trying to consume will cost them more than the harvest is worth. She paused. The CIC was absolutely silent. I spent 4 days trying to negotiate a peace. I failed. Not because the effort was wasted, but because the decision was made before I arrived. Ulvor came here to take this corridor, and nothing I could offer was going to change that. But I do not regret the attempt. And I do not regret standing here now, with 23 ships and the best crews in the Terran fleet, ready to make the Jorathi prefecture pay a price it did not expect to pay. She let the silence hold for 3 seconds. All stations, weapons free on my command. Mine drones to autonomous engagement mode on first contact. Fighter wings, execute on my order. Railgun batteries, priority targeting hunting group lead bioships first. Command bioship when the strike package clears the defensive screen. She sat in her command chair. The tactical plot showed the 2 fleets facing each other across the narrowing gap of the corridor, 23 blue icons, and 167 red, and between them, a field of 241 tiny yellow dots that were the mine drones, waiting. The clock counted down. At 0, the Jorathi fleet moved. 167 bioships surged forward in a coordinated wave, their hunting groups dispersing exactly as intelligence had predicted, their neural link networks pulsing with synchronized bioluminescence as they accelerated toward the corridor's center. The first hunting group hit the mine drone field at full speed, 7 bioships, packed tight for coordination. 3 mines detonated within 4 seconds, their warheads punching through bioarmor and detonating inside the organic hulls. 2 bioships shattered, their bioceramic plating splitting open in sprays of dark fluid and structural tissue. A third listed hard, its propulsion organs failing, its bioluminescence flickering as its neural connection to the network degraded. The mine drones were working. Across the engagement zone, explosions bloomed as the autonomous warheads found their targets, each detonation a brief, silent flash that left another Jorathi bioship crippled or dead. In the first 90 seconds, 31 mines found targets. 22 bioships were destroyed. 9 were damaged. 22 out of 167. Not enough. Not yet. Railgun batteries, Vasek ordered. Open fire. The Blackmount fired first, 6 simultaneous railgun slugs crossing 30,000 kilometers in slightly over 1/10 of a second. Each one a 10-kilogram tungsten projectile traveling at a velocity that turned it into a weapon of physics rather than engineering. 3 slugs hit their targets. 3 hunting group lead bioships ceased to exist, not destroyed so much as disaggregated. Their bioceramic hulls unable to absorb the kinetic energy, their structural integrity failing catastrophically in sprays of debris and frozen organic matter. The rest of the fleet fired in a staggered ripple. 23 ships, each firing between 2 and 6 railgun rounds in the opening salvo. The corridor filled with streaks of kinetic death. Bioships died in clusters, their hunting groups suddenly headless, their coordination faltering as the neural link network registered loss after loss. Strike package execute, Vasek ordered. 16 fighters broke from their rally point and dove toward the center of the Jorathi formation at maximum acceleration, driving straight for Ulvor's command bioship. They crossed the first defensive screen in 12 seconds, losing 2 fighters to escort organism intercept fire. The second screen cost them 3 more. The third screen cost 4. 7 fighters punched through into the clear space around the command bioship and fired everything they had. The command bioship took 9 direct hits from anti-capital ordnance. Its bioceramic hull cracked along 3 structural fault lines. Its bioluminescence red, pulsing, the heartbeat of the neural link network flickered, stuttered, and died. Across the engagement zone, 137 surviving Jorathi bioships shuddered simultaneously as the neural link's central node went dark. For 11 seconds, the entire fleet lost coordination. Hunting groups that had been moving in perfect synchronization became individual ships, each one suddenly relying on its own biological intelligence instead of the network's collective processing. In those 11 seconds, Vasek's fleet killed 19 more bioships. Total Jorathi losses: 63 capital bioships destroyed, 37% of the 3rd expansion fleet annihilated in 7 minutes of combat. The neural link network rebuilt itself. The Jorathi biological systems were redundant, adaptive, designed to survive exactly this kind of decapitation strike. But the rebuilt network was slower, less coordinated, operating at maybe 60% of its original capacity. The surviving hunting groups reformed, but their movements were ragged, their synchronization imperfect. Vasek watched the tactical plot and felt the cold mathematics shift, not enough to win, but enough to matter. All ships fall back to line Lion, she ordered. Maintain fire. Concentrate on damaged hunting groups, finish what the mines started. The fleet withdrew in good order, firing as they went, and the Jorathi followed, and the Second Jorathi War had begun in the corridor of empty space that 2 civilizations had agreed to keep empty, and Renata Vasek, who had spent 4 days building a bridge of words across the space between two fleets, knowing that the tide was coming, knowing that the bridge would not hold, and building it anyway because the alternative was to stop trying. And she was not the kind of officer who stopped trying, commanded her fleet from the CIC of the ardent resolve, and made the Jorathi prefecture pay for every kilometer of corridor it consumed. They held Line Lion for 47 minutes. The Cairnhalo took a direct hit from a bioorganic penetrator that breached her port armor belt and vented 3 compartments to vacuum. Her crews sealed the breaches in 90 seconds and kept firing. The Ashburn destroyed 11 bioships at Lion, more than any other vessel in the fleet, before a hunting group flanked her, and scored 4 hits across her engine section that cut her thrust capacity by half. They held Line Tiger for 31. The destroyer TDS Pale Vigil, 11 months deployed, her crew held together by discipline and dark humor, and the stubborn refusal to let exhaustion become surrender, was overwhelmed by a 9-ship hunting group that coordinated a simultaneous ram and fire attack from 3 vectors. The Pale Vigil killed 5 of the 9 before her hull failed. There were no escape pods. The TDS Sentinel Dawn, a frigate, was caught between 2 hunting groups during the withdrawal from Tiger and torn apart in 14 seconds. Her captain's last transmission was 2 words: "Still firing." They held Line Bear for 19, and by then the fleet had lost 6 ships and 3,200 personnel, and had destroyed 91 Jorathi bioships, 54% of the 3rd expansion fleet. And the Jorathi advance had slowed from a surge to a grind, each kilometer purchased at a cost that Ulvor's replacement commander had not anticipated paying. When the order to withdraw finally came from Frontier Command, 4 hours too late, authorizing Vasek to fall back to the secondary defense line at Keithrin Station, where 14 fresh warships were staging, Vasek complied. She took her 17 surviving ships and her 16,000 surviving personnel, and she withdrew from the Sething corridor in good order. And the Jorathi did not pursue, because they had lost 91 bioships and their Neuralink network was operating at 40% capacity, and pursuing a fleet that had just cost them more than half their combat power was not something their degraded biology could coordinate. The corridor fell. The Jorathi took it as Vasek had known they would. But they took it with a fleet so diminished that holding it required reinforcements that took months to grow. And in those months, the Terran Frontier Command built the defense in depth that would eventually stop the Jorathi expansion at the Battle of Keithrin Station, 7 months later, where 41 human warships met the Jorathi 2nd expansion fleet and broke it. Vasek was at Keithrin Station. She commanded the left wing. The Ardent Resolve fired 211 railgun rounds in that engagement, a fleet record that stood for 9 years. But that was later. In the corridor, after the last diplomatic channel closed, and before the first mine detonated, there were 11 seconds of absolute silence, the space between the end of words and the beginning of weapons, the gap between what might have been and what was. Renata Vasek spent those 11 seconds looking at the tactical plot, at the 23 blue icons and the 167 red ones, and she thought about the bridge she had built, 4 days of proposals and counter-proposals and carefully worded compromises, a structure made of language and good faith stretched across a divide that was always too wide to span. She had built it knowing it would fall. She had built it anyway. That was the monument, not in sand, whatever Ulvor had said, in something harder. In the 11 seconds of silence that proved she had tried, and in the cost her fleet imposed that proved the trying was not all she could do. 91 bioships, 54%, 17 ships surviving of 23. The numbers that wrote the first page of the Second Jorathi War, and the name that history recorded at the top of the page, Vasek. The corridor fell, the line held, the war began. And it began because one captain had spent 4 days building something beautiful across an impossible divide, and when it broke when the tide came, exactly as she knew it would, she was ready.